People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
Fella, I just cut this underneath thing. You better come along with us.
You're gonna get used to wearing them chains after a while, Luke. Don't you never stop listening to them clinking. 'Cause they're gonna remind you of what I've been saying.
Wish you'd stop being so good to me, Captain.
Don't you ever talk that way to me. Never! Never! What we've got here is failure to communicate. What we've got here is failure to communicate. What we've got here...
What we got here
failure to communicate.
is a failure to communicate.
Get yourself a sweetener, dog, dressed in rhinestone, setting on pedestal of abalone shell. Going 90, I ain't scary, 'cause I got the Virgin Mary assuring me that I won't go hell.
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is El Goro.
Picking it up here, balls.
Also with us today is Mr. Andrew Nette.
What we got here is failure to communicate.
Let's hope we can resolve that today. On this episode, we are looking at Stuart Rosenberg's 1967 film, Cool Hand Luke. The film stars Paul Newman as the titular Luke. He's a former war hero who cuts the heads off some parking meters and gets tossed into a chain gang for his crimes. There, he experiences some communication problems. We will be spoiling this film as we go along, so if you don't want anything ruined, please turn off the podcast and go watch the movie. You really owe it to yourself. Until then, we will still be here and waiting for you. So, Andrew, when was the first time you saw Cool Hand Luke, and what did you think?
This would have been one of the many films I saw on a Sunday night at the movies with my parents on TV. As I think I've said on this podcast before, movie night on Sunday on free-to-air TV was a big deal in our house, and it exposed me to a large number of films that were probably far too sophisticated and totally inappropriate to me. They were great, and this was one of them. I think I liked it at the time, but it's a somewhat complex film, and I probably didn't get all the aspects that I got when I rewatched it more recently for this podcast. But it's a great prison film. It's a great Newman film. And I also think and this will happen again throughout the podcast, but shout out to Stuart Rosenberg, who did some great stuff. He was the director of this film, and no one ever really talked about it. So, yeah, and I also think watching it again, and I didn't get this, obviously, when I watched it when I was about 17 with my parents on free-to-air TV, but working class sort of male rebels of the sort of mid-60s in America just before the counterculture. And this film is obviously one of several themes along that theme that came out at the time in 1956, 1967.
I'm trying to think exactly when I first saw this movie. I can tell you distinctly where I was first exposed to at least part of it. It came courtesy of a audio sample that was utilized in Guns N' Roses' Civil War, their opening track on Use Your Illusion 2, which came out when I was a kid. And
that makes me feel so
I know,
old.
I apologize. I do apologize. I have that habit when I lay out the fact that I was only born in 85 to certain folks. For that, the very first thing I was exposed to, appropriately enough, was Strother Martin's stuttering delivery of what we got here. I'm not going to try it, but the failure to communicate. And then I probably looped around into seeing the film probably sometime when I was in high school, which I do think is the optimal time for most young men to see a film like Cool Hand Luke. You come for the element of disillusioned rebellion and the sticking it to the authority, and then as you grow up with the movie, you can become to appreciate the deeper themes involved.
Yeah, this was one that just always seemed to be around. I don't remember the first time I saw it. I remember the first time that I realized that the Tarring the Road scene had the same music as Channel 7 Action News. And I'm curious, from what I understand, Andrew, that actually crossed over the ocean and Australia used that as well, correct?
Absolutely. Which it was absolutely bizarre. That was on, I can't remember whether it was Channel 7 or Channel 9 News, but yes, it was used, the song for the 6 o'clock.
Yeah, it was so strange when I just suddenly realized, oh, that's the same music. And I was probably, 12, 13 years old or something. And I just thought it was like the most astounding thing. Luckily, I was smart enough to realize this movie came before the Action News theme, that it wasn't the opposite, that Laszlo Schifrin didn't grab the news theme and just throw it into this movie.
But at least got royalty from it. If it got entered into a library, I hope he got a cut.
Oh, yeah. I think that he made bank big time when it came to the Action News theme. Yeah. And yeah, it's a great score. And the thing that I really realized today when I was listening to it again, because sometimes I'll watch a movie, sometimes I'll listen to a movie, didn't realize just how much the movie is listening to the convicts. That we have Paul Newman singing Plastic Jesus, and then Plastic Jesus comes back as a reprise from the score. And just those times too where we've got so many spirituals being sung in here, mostly by Harry Dean Stanton, or Dean Stanton as he's known in this movie. And those also enter or are echoed by the score as well. And then the score does its own thing. And sometimes the score, I love there are these moments in the movie where we are breaking up scenes and we just show, here's the trucks in the morning, they're out on the road, the sun has barely risen, and then you get that great bop, 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 bop. And you get like that a few times. There are moments where it's just, we don't really know how to go from this scene to another, so we're going to have this transition, and those transitions are beautiful. This movie is so well shot. Of course, Conrad Hall just doing an amazing job with the look and feel of it, but all of the pieces just fire so well. The direction, the music, the cinematography, the editing, and of course the acting. And we talked a few months ago on the show about the Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3 and what a glorious time that is for people who love character actors, especially 70s character actors like me. And this is another one where you're like, oh, look at the background. There's Joe Don Baker. Oh, look at over there. It's so many people in this movie. It's wild. And what a great cast of characters.
I'm glad you brought up the different elements of the film that were really working for you. And Andrew, I believe you did the same, insofar that one of the people that does get overlooked in all of this, and Andrew, you alluded to this earlier, was Stuart Rosenberg. In fact, I've come across a lot of lines of critique on this film that suggest that this film succeeds almost in spite of him, that it is due to the presence of Newman and all the other gentlemen in the film. And it is, to be fair, mostly guys in this movie. I think we have a grand total of 2 women and only one has a speaking line.
The other speaks with her body.
That she does. Something that sweet and innocent has got to be named Lucille.
2 non-speaking female roles.
2 non-speaking female roles. then I guess if we want to count the photograph. Anyway, I think that to completely cut Rosenberg out of the equation is doing him a tremendous disservice. And it really just, to me, it kind of strikes of, this is a very sort of singular work in his filmography. He's done a lot of great films over the years, in my opinion, and some of them are rightfully regarded as classics, flawed or otherwise. But none of them are quite at the same level, in my opinion, as something like Cool Hand Luke. As much as I enjoy stuff like Amityville Horror, or recently I watched Brubaker, which was very close in theme to Cool Hand Luke, and happened to star the other person who was in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Anyway, it almost feels like there are certain critics that seem to suggest that Rosenberg is a director unworthy of a film like this. And I cannot disagree more.
I totally agree. I totally agree with you about that, L. And just picking up on a couple of the points you guys have made. I agree with you, Mike. The way film passes, it marks the passing of time. It's just absolutely terrific. The chain gang coming out in that dark blue morning, and then the trucks going out, and they're on the chain gang just doing meaningless work, clearing roads during the day and then coming back at night. Not a lot. It's interesting because apart from the escape scene, and this is very typical of a lot of prison films, and we'll talk about this later, not a lot happens. So it's actually the way that Rosenberg is able to make this quite a gripping film, I think, is really good. And I think he was, I don't know if he was an auteur. What is an auteur? Maybe that's the next Projection Booth podcast, what is an hour and a half on auteur theory. He was a solid filmmaker, Rosenberg. He was, I think, a lot of modern critics, when they use the words workmanlike, which is something I've seen applied to Rosenberg, it's actually a bit of a slight, I think. This guy was better than workmanlike, I think. Pocket Money, 1972, The Laughing Policeman, 1973, Amityville Horror, Brubaker, The Pope of Greenwich Village in 1984, which I watched again for this podcast. Terrific pre-gentrification New York film with Eric Roberts and Mickey Rourke. And also the other film I watched for this podcast was WUSA, in 1970. I don't know if either of you guys have seen that film. Yeah, based on a Robert Stone book set in with Joanne Woodward and Newman in a sort of, again, pre-gentrified New Orleans in 1970 with an alcoholic, Newman, working as a disc jockey for a right-wing radio station. Terrific film. And while I agree Brubaker, another of Rosenberg's films in 1980, was very close to the spirit of Cool Hand Luke, WUSA is really a spiritual heir of this film in terms of another laconic male anti-hero role. But yeah, Rosenberg, terrific filmmaker.
I'm a huge fan of The Laughing Policeman and hope to do that on the show one of these days. That's another one. Going back to Taking Pelham 1, 2, 3, I put that alongside of The Laughing Policeman and Charlie Varick as three just super solid crime films that we've got Walter Matthau doing in the early 70s. And that's another one, Laughing Policeman, another one with an amazing cast. You've got some people from this coming back. I know for sure Anthony Zerbe comes back. And then you also get Bruce Dern, Lou Gossett Jr., R.I.P. It's terrific. And Paul Newman, who is, to me, so smart, or was so smart, also R.I.P. for him, but he made, 4 movies with Rosenberg? I don't think he's going to be making movies with somebody who can't hold water. He had faith in Rosenberg enough to work with him 3 more times at least with The Drowning Pool, WSA, and Pocket Money.
The Drowning Pool, yes. That was the other one I missed. Yes, exactly.
He's not going to align himself with lackluster talent.
And speaking of what you were saying there, Andrew, the notion of using the term workman, I've used it similar, but to me, it's always just been a director who could be relied upon. You could put him in pretty much anything, and he's going to turn out at least something of a certain quality. And perhaps it is a genre bias, the fact that Rosenberg would dip into various genre storytelling, whether it be the thrillers or the horror films or what have you. Maybe that was enough to disincline certain people from giving him the credit that he's due. But the way that this film is played out, the space that is given for performance, and also the spaces for those pregnant pauses. just as Luke says, it's almost like he's just passing time. At times, the movie is just passing time, but it makes us aware of it. It lets us follow these men in this never-ending time. Because that's one of the things that strikes me about this movie. Unlike some other prison dramas, where you'll mark it just based upon the years that pass, and they'll acknowledge that, you almost don't get that sense in Cool Hand Luke. How long did the events of this film take place? Did they take place over a month? Did they take place over a week? Did they take place over several years? We don't know. The weather never changes. And so it just becomes this sort of purgatory for these men, this never-ending slew of get up, do your work, keep passing the time. And I think that actually works to the benefit of the film rather than being a detriment.
Well, there's also this whole thing of looking for something to do. I didn't have anything else to do. I was just passing the time. You're saying is when he talks about his war record, it seemed like the idea at the time. He just wants something to do, something to entertain him. He's such an interesting character that it just feels like he was set on this path so long ago of challenging authority that he goes into the army, that he does all these great things, gets the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, Purple Heart, and he's busted back down to buck private before he leaves the army. Okay, and that's his whole thing, is just challenging authority. And then you get that weird, complicated relationship with his mother partway through the first or second act. So I guess it's the second act of the film. And just what is going on with this person? And I love that the actress who was playing his mother was only 2 years older than he was, but they made her look fantastic. She looks like she's about to die. And apparently she specialized in playing older women throughout much of her career. Even back on stage, she would play older characters. But as soon as he busts out and starts calling her Arletta by her first name, and you realize that the direction that Rosenberg gave her was to flirt with Luke, it's okay, this is a little twisted here. And they don't go into his father too much in the movie, but in the book, he definitely talks about how his father was a preacher and ended up running off. So it really puts this whole question of his faith into the spotlight. And we'll definitely be talking about that a lot more later.
And I'm glad that element, at least in terms of his father being a preacher, didn't make it into the film. Because to me, that would have provided additional level of context and characterization. But to me, his defiance against God was just one more institution for him to push back against. One more thing that is being set up to put him in a box, to give them these rules. Yet another boss, except this time it's the boss in the sky. So I like the fact that element wasn't carried over into the film. It makes it feel a bit more, just primal.
But he's also a very definitely Newman still. And it's amazing, as you say, Mike. I think he was 44 when he was in Cool Hand Luke, and his body looks incredible, which is why you can get away with things in this film, like so much of the film just focusing on a little laconic smile or a little sometimes nothing, a really cool hand to have. These little moments, and at the very end of the film, of course, you have this montage of Luke mugging it for the camera and his best smirks, smiles, and grimaces during the film, which in any other film I think would be terrible, but worked in this film because it's new. He's also such a terrible rebel. He's he's a nothing rebel. He's not really rebelling against anything. He's got no direction. He's got no politics that we can see. There's as you say, there's a mention of him being a war hero. And I do wonder, and this is something that I think maybe is in the book a bit more, is the suggestion that he's also working through some sort of post-traumatic shock disorder as a result of what went on with the war, which is very light in the film. But he's so charismatic that these men look up to him, partly because they're so bored and there's nothing going on, but partly because he is charismatic, but he's got nowhere to lead them. And he doesn't really even want to lead. And I think the most telling scene in the film is that scene towards the end where he has his third breakout, and you know when he gets captured, and it's going to be when they're going to kill him because Strother Martin's already basically said, third time you're dead. And Dragline comes along for the ride because he's just following Luke wherever he wants to go in a sort of weird, homoerotic, also this guy is so charismatic type of way. And Dragline saying, oh, look, it's really good the way that you pretended that the guards had broken you. I know I'm jumping ahead a lot here, but that you planned this all along, and so it was such a great escape. And and Luke says that I never planned anything in my life. This guy has just drifted along, boozer, he just gets into trouble, charismatic, but not really any kind of great political leader or anything. And I think that's the strength, actually, when I was thinking about it, of Newman's persona in this period of film. So I think it was Eberts that noted that Cool Hand Luke was less of a reinvention than it was a culmination of a series of films he'd done, The Hustler, HUD, Harper, and Hombre, which are all about what heroism was in mid-1960s America. And this is another one of those films. But his whole persona, when I was thinking about it, Newman, he's a very suburban, non-threatening rebel, which I think is probably, it's really interesting. And I wonder whether that's why he was so popular in cinema, because he's handsome as hell. He's he plays these rebellious individuals, but they're not really rebelling against it. It's just a general rebellion against the sort of ennui that was mid-1960s culture before the counterculture really kicked in.
I was really reminded when I was reading the book, I was so reminded of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And of course, I'm not the first person to think about that. But I looked up last night and Cuckoo's Nest came out in 1962. I think this, as far as the book goes, this book and movie were very close together. I want to say 1965 for the book, 1967 for the movie. And then, of course, Cuckoo's Nest, the movie, would come out in the 1970s. And even on the audio commentary, I think it's Eric Laxus talking, and he said that Newman feels more like a 70s hero in this movie than a 60s hero, because he is having that ennui and is having that problem. But then when you think about things like Bonnie and Clyde came out this same year, this is the beginning, right? This is the beginning of new Hollywood and challenging authority. And this is as the old system is breaking apart. And I think Luke comes in at the perfect time for that. But this does feel more like a 70s film than a 60s film a lot of times to me.
It does, especially from, as you say, the sort of philosophy behind it. That broader sense of that broader sense of something rotten within the institution that needs to be opposed. People not quite sure how they're going to do it, but they just feel instinctually it needs to be pushed back against. And that's one of the things that I enjoy about this film, and why I said it's a film that the first time everybody should see it, ideally, is when they're a teenager. Because there's something about that sort of directionless rebellion that resonates so strongly with practically any teenager. I would put money down, even teenagers today are still going to feel that resonant call of, what are you rebelling against? What have you got? It fits in with that sort of vibe. But one of the things that definitely seems to mark it in terms of the 70s film is the nature of how the film ends. Very little is actually accomplished by Luke. As you said, Andrew, he's not an effective rebel. But there's still the small hints, crack in the seemingly insurmountable edifice of authority, with the man with no eyes getting his sunglasses broken, the laughter that's shared between the cons, that sort of communion that they have, that they can come together in celebration and to continue the gospel of Luke, which, well, yeah, that's a bit on the nose. This is a movie that's filled with on-the-nose religious stuff.
That the man with no eyes, the man with the sunglasses, is boss Godfrey. I'm like, oh boy.
Just look at the pose of Luke after he eats 50 eggs.
Yeah. And then that drag line, you forget that this movie is revealed to be a flashback at the end, that it is Dragline telling the story outside of the church, which is in keeping with the book, but the movie doesn't start with Dragline talking about this. It starts with him cutting the heads off of the parking meters. But yeah, it's wild to realize, oh, this is Dragline telling this story. So it is that proselytizing. It is that gospel, like you're saying. It's him as St. Paul basically going around and spreading the gospel of Luke. It's wild. Though I could say that Dragline is almost the Judas. If we're going to say that the scene in the church is the Garden of Gethsemane, yes, Jesus, if I can say that, him, Luke railing against God and having that conversation. Why me? What are you doing? I try to fit in. You make it so I can't fit in. You dealt me this shitty hand. And then when Drag comes back in, he's just, oh, they caught me right after I left you. I'm like, you might as well just walk right up to Luke and just plant a big old kiss on him, because that's exactly what's going on here. And maybe it's that I'm recording on Good Friday, but I don't think so.
And again, one gets the feeling that if perhaps this was made in the 70s, the last image of the film may not have been Luke smiling, but Dragline hung from a tree, just to put the complete bow on the Judas.
Picking up on your point, Mike, about those films, I definitely think Clyde Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde in 1967. I think this film resonates very much, and it's also your point that you made, Goro, about directionless rebellion. Benjamin Braddock in The Graduate, another total misdirected, what am I even rebelling against film. I also think, Nicholson as Robert Dupia in Bob Raffleson's 5 Easy Pieces, which is another one of those angry young men rebelling against what. And then, of course, as you say, Mike, R.P. Murphy, Nicholson as R.P. Murphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is a completely chimes with Cool Hand Luke. But it's interesting watching it now when you're a bit older, because you just think, oh, Luke, can you get your act together a bit? Can you just... Because it's this series of bullshit, Pyrrhic victories that he wins, which are great. And Tarring the Road is a great one. Hey, let's work really hard and finish this off really quickly, so we'll have an hour at the end of the day and it will really piss off all the guards. The bullshit escapes that he does, knowing that he's going to get caught, and of course he does get caught. They want him as a leader. He's got moral authority over the prisoners. Why the guards hate him and they target him, but he's no leader, and he's such a loner. In that respect, I suppose he is a great model for alienated young boys, 16, 17, all over the world.
If I had a poster of Cool Hand Luke in my dorm, that would have been on brand for me. But yeah, he is a great character that way. And yeah, more around the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest connections. When Dragline attacks Boss Godfrey at the end really reminds me of when R.P. McMurphy strangles the big nurse. The whole thing of her in her starch white uniform is very similar to Boss Godfrey and his sunglasses. And like you said, removing of the sunglasses. And it's great that we never even see his eyes. Like that shot at the end when his glasses go off, you're like, oh, now I can see his face. But you can't. He obscures that and then gets in the car, and you just see those sunglasses get crushed under the tire. Wow, that is amazing. What an amazing character. And that they took that character from the book and just stripped out all of his dialogue and made him this force in nature. And I thought what they really did well, too, was to give Strother Martin as the captain a lot more and really made him more integral. They bring him in pretty early into the film. He is almost having a conversation with Luke at one point when they're talking about the war record, and he's talking about all the men that they have there. And, oh, we got this guy who's doing 20 years. And it's so smart to use him as a villain and to have that 1-2 punch of him and Boss Godfrey, but then all those other minor villains of all the other bosses. And again, a who's who of amazing faces with that. Luke Askew looks so good in this. And you compare what he looks like in 2 years in Easy Rider. Oh yeah. And then you look at freaking Dennis Hopper, and you're like, in 2 years, you're going to make that movie, this groundbreaking movie. And you look pretty clean cut here. But yeah. And then who's some of the other bosses that you've got? Like Robert Donner is
Anthony Zerbe is a prisoner, but he's Dog Boy.
Yes. Anthony Zerbe is so good. Charles Tyner, who I don't know if he ever gets any lines, but he's got the best face. Most people would remember. I would remember him from Harold and Maude, and just his amazing role in there where he is the one-armed, is he like former army guy, right? He's so good. All of these character actors, and freaking Strother Martin is he just exudes that like folksy, I'm just an okay guy, but he's got the biggest evil streak that you could possibly imagine. All of these guys, especially towards the end when they're trying to break Luke with the whole dirt in my hole thing. Holy shit.
And they basically murder him.
Oh, yeah.
And that's there's lots of lovely light touches in this film, which I think is the script, obviously. But also, let's give it to Rosenberg. Let's bring it on down for Rosenberg. Some lovely light touches, like little things when one of those prison guards says, I've been guarding, trying to justify what a good guy is. I think he says, in the 20 years that I've been guarding prisoners, I've never shot a white man. Just that. And as you say, Martin, really fantastic. And that line, what we've got here is failure to communicate, which isn't in the book, which they gave to him in the scripts, and which I think works because it's exactly the kind of thing that an uneducated prison warder who's been forced to start doing courses where he's got to talk about how they communicate with the prisoners, this kind of stuff that's starting to happen with prison reform in the 1950s, and the way that social services are going to 1950. You can see both of Martin's character basically being dragged into some seminar where he's lectured about the communication is where we're at now. We're about rehabilitation. We're about all of this. So he sits without really understanding it, and it just sounds so evil. The other revelation for me in this film is George Kennedy as Dragline. I just think, obviously George, much like you guys, George Kennedy, I have seen George Kennedy in umpteen film. I've got to say most of them, nothing I've really remembered. And my most vivid memory of Kennedy which is great, is having it up in the Naked Gun films with Leslie Nielsen, which is fantastic. And then to see him in this film, the guy can really act. He's terrific, a great heart, but he's just superb as the blustery sort of long-term con who doesn't really know it. He's king of this very small world, and they establish, I think, that, and that's a key trope of prison films, which I know we're going to talk about later, is the introduction to when the new cons go into the prison and basically get introduced to the guy who's the boss con, who's a sort of blustering bully and rules over this small, hermeneutically all-male world of the prison. But as Dragline, and he won an Oscar for this Best Supporting Actor, Oscar for Dragline, he's really good. And it was a real revelation. One of the great things about rewatching this film recently is this, wow, this guy Kennedy, he was great in it.
And it's interesting to look at the sort of how the prison dynamics roll out, especially in relation to where the prison genre would go. And I think part of it may be attributed to with a reduction of, or a relaxing of standards in the films and the dissolution of the Hays Code, they could get freer to show more brutality in prison life. But what's interesting with Cool Hand Luke is while there is elements of the prison that are very brutal, the treatment of the guards, of the prisoners, is certainly up there, for Luke in particular. The actual treatment and the dynamics between the prisoners doesn't have that same level of menace that plays into so many other prison dramas. That maybe it's because of their sort of shared issues that they're all in the chain gang. They all have to work back-breaking labor all day. But while there is a little bit of ribbing for the new meat that come in, they can integrate it in pretty quickly. Dragline has the boxing match against Luke, but outside of that, there's not a lot of harassment. There's certainly not any implication of sexual violence, which is somewhat of a hallmark in the prison genre, which become, of course, later on, again, with the softening of the Hays Code and the ability to show that kind of thing. But it is something that sets Cool Hand Luke very much apart from a lot of other prisons dramas that came afterwards, insofar that so much of it is about the inherent camaraderie between these men.
Yeah, in the book, they call themselves the family, which I find to be very revealing, that they aren't antagonistic with one another, that they're trying to help each other out. And to go back to the Christ metaphor, it's a little Last Supper when they put so much food onto Luke's plate and he will get punished if he doesn't eat everything on his plate. And the way the men come by and all take a bite off of his plate, they're all in this together. The way that they're taking communion, let's say, with his food, and the way that they will throw down their plate after they're done, or their spoon or whatever, and just, that's it. I've done my part. They're all there. Could easily have turned into everyone's coming with knives and they're treating him like Julius Caesar, but instead they're all there to feast off of his plate and save him. I love that whole moment.
That's a class thing. That characterizes prison films, I would say, up until about the 1990s, is that they're essentially stories about working class life in prison. And there is that kind of it's damaged. And I think your point, El Goro, is good about the way that, as we go into the 70s and the 80s, these prison films become much more brutal and they show what's going on in prison much more. But there's still that sense of class solidarity, I think, that you find in those earlier prison films, which I think breaks down as class breaks down as we're going towards the new millennium. And that's very on display in Cool Hand Luke. They're all bunch, with the exception of the one character, Society Red, who's J.D. Cannon. That's his nickname. He can actually read. He actually knows what's going on. He's slightly apart from the rest of the prisoners, but still in with them because there's that basic solidarity there. Guards are all working class people too, and of course that's the classic prison film trope, isn't it? Really, the guards are the prisoners is just the flip side of the same group of people who there for the grace of God, there I go. But also, in some respects, the guards are as much trapped by this, and this is something we can talk about when we talk about prison films later. The guards are as much trapped by life in prison and institutionalized by life in prison and brutalized by life in prison as the prisoners are.
And what you were talking about in the terms of society, that not only is he coded as being of a different class, but still part of them, he's also curiously coded as being very northern. Because this is very southern. It's a very southern movie, but he's the one. Not everybody attempts a southern accent, but he doesn't even try. So he definitely feels somewhat othered, but at the same time, he's still just part of the group. I also love the fact that he's the only one who wears full pajama tops. He has like a full button-up set of pajamas that he wears. It's a small detail, but it's one that I appreciate.
I love those moments when the other cons know to give him space. Like when he gets the message about his mother dying and they all just move out and let him have that space, or after he's eaten the 50 eggs and they all leave him there in that Christ-like pose. And I think it's the guy who is the other champion eater who is built like a brick shithouse, this guy.
Yes,
I don't know the actor.
That is Buck Talion, who was, he was a bodybuilder back in the day after he did a stint, I believe, in the Navy. Detroit native, by the way, so shout out to Mike. Though he did move to New York City, apparently, when he was like 2. But yeah, he was bodybuilder, professional wrestler on some of the lesser circuits into that. I don't think he ever wrestled for Vince McMahon Sr., who would have been operating out of New York or in the Connecticut area around that time. But yeah, as you say, he makes an impression when he first shows up. This guy's huge, and we're not used to seeing a guys with that kind of build at this era. It's the same of impact that when William Smith would show up as a guest star on various 70s television. With again,
I think after Luke is done with the eggs, he leaves a tribute of his spoon.
Yeah, because he used to be the champion eater.
Are around Luke's head. It looks like he's got that angelic radiance around him that you see in old paintings, and so great. There are so many things that are working so well for this. And going back to Dragline, that's really, for me, where we get to see the character. What is going to paint Luke for the entire rest of the movie is when they do have that boxing match and Luke will not give up. And it's just over and over. You have to stay down. You have to give up. And I think that's even presaged a little bit when Harry Dean Stanton's singing Lord Let It Be, and just leave it be. If you don't have to be a dick all the time, Luke, or just be that rebel, because he's not really a dick, but he just always has to buck the system every single time, and he will just keep getting up. He'll keep fighting. He'll keep getting up. One of the other smart things I think from that they changed from the book to the movie is it is not a matter of Luke escapes, Luke comes back, Luke immediately escapes again. There's a lot of time in between those escape attempts. But in the movie, it's maybe a few weeks pass between the second and third attempt. But man, oh man, between the first and second, I think it's that night he's already out the gate again. Or he's shaking the bush right there. That's the second one, is when he's shaking the bush. And that's like the day that they brought him back. And when Strother Martin kicks him down the hill, it's okay, I guess I'm going to escape again. Here's this string that I have. I already have this planned out.
It's intriguing, isn't it? Because it suggests that actually the fights is easy to escape from. Is that most of them don't want to.
And as I say, the brutality of the guards in somewhat is justified because the chain gangs, it's a group of men that outnumber the people that are watching them out in the open, working on these fields and doing these kind of jobs. So the only way that you could keep kind of control is brutality. And the brutality and the punishment is the only way that they could disincentivize people from wanting to try it again. But that second escape is one of my favorite smaller moments in the movie, where he's breaking his chains, and he does so by talking to the two black kids. And I love the interaction between them, because there's a small element of the racial tension, where Luke does call one of them boy, which, yes, he's much younger than him, but as we all know, that term carries a lot more weight in the South in regards to African Americans. But what I love is what happens after, when he tells them, hey, you're going to see something funny. And at no point do these kids point him out to the law. At no point do they do it, because it goes completely without saying. There would be no way in hell those kids would talk to the cops, because it wasn't so long that the lady hanging the bush or the laundry may even have memories of being chased by dogs or knew people who were. It is that subtle element that it's there. It's not necessarily signposted, but it's an element of the world building that I really appreciate. And it's just funny seeing that kid with that axe.
It's the black church that he's hiding in. And when he goes into that black part of town, Don Pierce, the author, even points out, oh yeah, there had been some young men who had been killed recently. And you could even see the burned out wreckage of some stuff where a bunch of white guys came in and did their version of justice. So it was like, yeah, this makes total sense that Luke is going to go in there, because nobody's going to snitch on him whatsoever. And they don't even bother to ask the people that live there, because they know they're just going to get no's for answers. I didn't see anything.
Just going back to that point about, and this is something I was really paying attention to when I watched it this time, is the number of who's a prisoner and who's a guard, and who's a prisoner that sort of crossed over to the guard, speaks to that institutionalization of those prisoners. So Dog Boy, because he's wearing prisoner, he's a prisoner that looks after the dogs. There's also Clifton James. I think we have to give it. Any man loses his spoon, spends the night in the box. That great scene at the beginning where he just reels off all the offences you can do. And then Luke finishes his sentence and Carr just says, I hope you're not going to be a hard case. But he's terrific. That's Clifton James, who plays Carr, who again is another one of those characters, because he's best known for mugging as Sheriff J.W. Pepper in Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun. But he's terrific as Carr. I think he's a prisoner too, because he's wearing kind of prison gear as well.
Well, I don't know. They refer to him as the walking boss, so
yeah, but
he might be. He didn't seem to be wearing the same kind of stuff as the rest of them. He didn't strike me as a trustee, because even Dog Boy was still wearing the prison grace. The fact that they have him in white, I'm thinking he's not. Sorry, he's the floor boss, not the walking boss. But I'm thinking that he's not a prisoner. But again, speaking of people that are trapped in there with him, the warden has his own little cottage out there. Who knows where the rest of the guards live? This guy actually has to live amongst them and literally smell them. The one who spent the most time around them.
He is there, though, when they're doing the 50 eggs thing. And I like that he has this kind of camaraderie with them a little bit. He doesn't seem like a hard ass, which is good. He's no pushover. And I wonder if the Coen brothers like this scene enough that it plays out almost exactly in the Hudsucker Proxy with the whole, if you do this, they dock you.
I have no doubt that Cool Hand Luke looms large in parts of the Coen brothers filmography. Just compare some of the shots of The Man with No Eyes with the gentleman from Raising Arizona, the demonic biker. And
Oh Brother, We're Out, though, with all of the prison stuff. Yeah, no, that's very true. We were talking about Drag and how he goes along with Luke during that last escape attempt. For me, one of the most heartbreaking things is when he goes, oh yeah, I only had a few months left. And I'm like, what the hell? Why did you do this to yourself?
Because he's not the sharpest tool in the box.
No, but he is amazing. George Kennedy, just to add on to your point, he's so good. And I just love that even though he's supposed to be this big old lunkhead, that you can see the wheels turning all the time. And just the way the chemistry between him and Paul Newman, especially during the egg eating scene, when all of a sudden Luke is like, oh boy, he goes over and splashes the water on his face and he just seems so decrepit. There's no way he's going to eat that last little bit of eggs. And pretty soon people are like, oh, he's not going to do it. And they start adding more to the bet, and Drags, they're like, okay, where's the big money men at? And then as soon as Society Red says, I believe you have it all, then Luke just pops back up. Okay, let's eat these last eggs. Yeah.
And that's definitely one of those things that has really entered into pop culture and into the zeitgeist. The 50 eggs, people say it's 100 eggs. It's 50 eggs. But to the point that every time I watch it, I can't help but think one of the parodies that was made of it, which was in an episode of Malcolm in the Middle, where one of the older brothers claimed that he could eat 50 marshmallow peeps because he was at military school. And I just love the end of it where he's about to give up, and one of the people who had betted that he could. So nobody says, the rules say he has to have them in him, not that he has to eat them.
Oh,
and all of a
God.
sudden, and he scarfs down the last of them. Anytime I see Luke failing on that last one, I had the thing of, we just got to get it inside him.
I did want to talk about this whole thing of, I don't know how upset the bosses are with Luke for not believing in God. Is it just an excuse for them, or are they actually...
The one boss that Drew talked about earlier, the one who says he never shot a white man, he actually feels like he's trying to reach out to Luke on a religious side. Because later when they break Luke and digging the ditch, and Luke calls out to God, and he's, what was that? Who are you calling out to? I always got the sense that he at least was trying to evangelize, trying to bring Luke over, which is why he turned so brutal, because Luke took advantage of his kind heart to escape the second time by shaking the brat and shear, boss. I think that one was trying to get to him on make him right with God.
Is he the one that says when Luke's mother dies and he's chucking Luke in the box, that sort of small hot box they have to go? He says, I'll say a prayer for your ma tonight, Luke.
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, that's that guy, yes. The guards, there is the flip side of the prisoners again. They're just working class stiffs who happen to be heavily armed and shoot people.
Where it all breaks down. One wonders, was the motivation for him wanting to escape because his mother died, or was the motivation because he was punished for nothing? That he saw the corruption of the institution.
I kind of wonder too, because when Luke first really brings up God, it's when there's the rainstorm, and we've got at least 3 rainstorms during this movie. So of course, me looking for patterns, I'm like, okay, there's definitely a pattern going on here. In the second one is when he is out. All of the men, except for Drag and him, the men are in the trucks again. The bosses are in the trucks, and Luke and Drag are just outside in the rain. And he starts talking about how God is the big bearded boss in the sky. And he starts basically challenging God at that moment. I love that line, that love me, kill me, hate me, that thing that he's just like taunting God. And then it's only maybe the next scene or 2 scenes later where he gets the telegram from the folks that are saying that his mother's dead. And I'm like, did she die when that was happening? Was that God trying to send a message at that moment?
It could definitely be read that way.
I'm super atheist, so this movie really gets to me because it's seeing somebody who doesn't believe in God getting punished for not believing in God. I'm just like, yeah, it happens. You Christians may run the world, but you still treat us atheists like shit.
And that's the thing, that the film itself, for all of its religious imagery, it doesn't come out on God's side. Because again, at the end of the film, when he's talking about, he's praying to God, show me a sign. What does he show him? Dragline showing up saying that you're screwed, bud. Take us back to prison, or most likely kill you. One of the most heartbreaking scenes in the movie to me, and it still impacts me every time I watch it, is when he's singing, Plastic Jesus, which, it's his farewell to his mom. And you get the sense that was a song that she liked. And that's why he's singing it to her. But what is he singing about? He's singing about a kitschy plastic effigy of a Christ figure. That what value does it have? It's a piece of kitsch on a dashboard.
But it gives you hope. Makes you feel like you're not going to go to hell if you are driving 90 and happen to fly off the road.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's a film that's open to a fair amount of interpretation, but if you walked away with it not believing, I think that's supported in the material.
Even to go back to that moment with Luke having everyone eat off of his plate, it's pretty ironic that I think it's either the scene before or two scenes before is when all of the men are around him and they're just like, tell us about the picture. He's come in. The guy's had the shit kicked out of him because he ran away again, or that might be the first time.
Second time, I thought.
Second time. So he comes in, he's been beaten. They lay him out on the table again, like after the egg eating scene. And they're just like, oh, tell us about the picture. How many girls did you lay? Da, 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 da. And they're just all on him. And he's just like, get away from me. I had the picture made up. It's all phony. And just like really disillusioning all of these guys the first time, because they're going to get majorly disillusioned later on when he turns, quote unquote. And he yells at them, stop feeding off me.
Stop living through me.
Exactly. Well, and it so reminds me of, and I don't remember if this is in the Bible or if it's just in Jesus Christ Superstar, but it so reminds me of like when all the lepers are going for Jesus and he's just like, there's so little of me. You can't do this to me. And then literally 2 scenes later, they are eating off of his plate. And it's like, they are feeding off of you at this moment, Luke, but this is the good version of it.
I had not got half this religious imagery. I don't know whether I'm in Australia and I'm just not exposed to it as much as you guys are, but I think you're about to break out into a sermon, Mike.
It's a big part of this film is
Yes.
Luke as Christ figure.
Oh, yeah.
And I like it. I like that they do that and then subvert it. Because it's stop living through me. It's a contradiction of I am the light and I am the way. No, don't follow me. I don't want you to be following me. And at the one time where he's gone through this sort of thing, and then everybody has left him, he's just, where are you now? You were all over before. Where are you now? You get that allusion to why hast thou forsaken me? But again, I like the idea that the conclusion of it is essentially him thumbing his nose at any sort of higher authority. That it's not a direct attack, but it's with a wry bit of cynicism that's totally in keeping with the character of Luke and the character of the film. Because if any conclusion is to be drawn is, just as he says, he's just a big old sky boss. It's another institution that Luke is going to rebel against.
Yeah, when he betrays the men by becoming that lapdog to all the bosses, when Coco, Lou Antonio, flicks his cigarette at him while he's walking by, and you just see that disgust on their faces. I love that moment, and I keep wondering, when did he get the plan to do this? Because in the book, it's a really long con. In the movie, it's still a little bit of a con. And again, the men leave him alone when he comes back after he's had that revelation, right? After he's been out in the grave and coming out of the grave. No, boss, I won't do that. And doing the initial version of grabbing, I think it's Luke Askew's leg and just, oh, I'm so sorry. And then we'll get that later on when Drag grabs the man with no eyes. But when he comes back into the shack to go to sleep, all of the guys just go away from him. I'm like, oh, they're leaving him much like how they left him alone after his mother died. But here it's just pure disgust of our hero is no more. And then when he comes back and steals the truck, it makes that even better for those guys because now they get to see or think to themselves, oh, he was just fooling them all along. And to add on to your point from earlier, the whole thing of when the drag is like, oh, you fooled them. And he's, no, they broke me. And I'm like, whoa, okay. That you don't expect that from your hero to say, no, that really affected me.
They do truncate it down, though, that the timing is truncated down from the books quite a lot. I have to say the one thing about the film that annoys me is the way that Newman looks $1 million no matter what. He gets the shit beaten out of him by Dragline. I think he's got a slight bruise, but other than that, he's fine. He has these terrible escape attempts and then he comes back and the next day he's actually looking like $1 million again. As you say, that scene with him being broken by the guards and then stealing the trucks and escaping, very truncated and unlike the book, as you say, is dealing with a much broader expanse of time.
They did a great job of converting this book to a movie, to this adaptation, to even have the author actually in the movie, basically reprising his role. And the one thing that I really appreciate too about the movie over the book, even, and the book's fantastic. The first time I had read it, I think I've had a copy of it for probably 30 years, but I've never read it until this, finally kicking my ass into gear to read this. The thing that I like in the movie is that we don't have to worry about who the narrator is, because the narrator in the book is all Sailor, and he's telling us all of these stories. So when it comes to Luke's escape, we are as in the dark as he is until he starts to get the details. And after the second time, it becomes a little iffy, let's say, where it's like, oh, you just happen to hear all of these details. But at least with the movie, we're not stuck with him. We are not inside of his head. So we get to see Luke out in the world. We're not just hearing the details of it later. And we're also kept in the dark as well a little bit when it comes to that photograph that I talked about. We don't know what all of that stuff is, so we get to hear about it like the other prisoners do. And then it's nice, the third time that Luke escapes in the book, he is with Dragline, so we get to hear everything from Dragline telling Sailor the story, telling all the men the story. And the whole book is a flashback of Drag telling the story, and then it's Sailor going off into his own world, thinking about things and telling his point of view, and then going back occasionally to the Dragline story. So I thought they did a really good job, and that also that motivating factor as far as this scene, what happens in this scene leads to what happens in the next scene, which leads to the next scene, which leads to the next scene. There's nothing wasted in here as far as why we are seeing what we are seeing. There's no moment where it just, they could have cut that out, because everything has a very important piece. This is a really well-crafted script.
When they ripped that photo up, which I think is the peak disgust with Luke having been broken, and they rip up the photo, which is Luke with the two girls on one of his escapes, and he sent that photo back to the prisoners, and I think it then functions as a sort of idolatry masturbation piece for all the prisoners while they're...
Are they masturbating to the women, or are they to that bastard?
No, I was going to say that, Mike. Yes, that's right. It's Good Friday where you are. And then, of course, they take the very final scene of the film shows you that someone's taped the photo back up. And if I was to roll with the Christian thing, I'd say that's their Bible.
And you notice that the design of the tears is a cross.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
When you notice that where it is in the magazine, on the other page is somebody with a rifle basically pointing at Luke.
Yes.
It's wild.
But we need to give a shout out to Frank Pearson. So Pierce's 1965 novel, and Pierce was a really interesting guy because he'd actually spent, he's interesting for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons is that he had spent time on a Florida chain gang. But he does the adaptation, and he's helped by a guy called Frank Pearson. And I thought, who's this? Obviously brought in to help a novelist who's got no script writing experience do this script. Pearson's done Cat Ballou, the Anderson tapes, my absolute favourite John le Carre adaptation, The Looking Glass War, Dog's Day After, A Star is Born, and Presumed Innocent are all films that Pearson scripted. This guy's got, which explains why it's a good novel, explains why the adaptation to the screen is so on point, because this guy Pearson, Dog Day Afternoon, the Anderson tape, The Looking Glass, he can really script.
I remember seeing an interview with him in the special features that was on the Blu-ray release that I have of this. And he was talking about the movie I'd done prior to this was Cat Ballou, which was funny, but not my kind of funny. He much preferred the more cynical laughs that he could do in something like Cool Hand Luke.
Again, it all just comes together so well. And we talked about that music before. I can't say enough good things about this score. To do this Aaron Copland, Americana kind of stuff, but then you're doing more like rock influences at time, the way that you're mixing in the harmonica and the banjo and that the drum playing it with the brushes and everything just fits so well with this. And this is one of those scores where I can listen to it outside of the movie, but it just takes me back into the movie every single time I listen to it and makes me smile.
Go from harmonica to action news.
So this is based on, what is it? So Pierce was in that was actually based on the death of Luke, I think. It's his life partly. He's on a Florida chain gang, and he'd also been a counterfeiter. I think he'd been a merchant marine. This is Don Pierce, and then he basically goes back to the US, becomes a cat burglar, and then gets busted, and then lands on in a prison farm in Florida. He bases the book partly on his own experience, believed that the 50 egg eating scene would actually happen to Pierce. And then he's also basing it on the other cons that he meets while he's in the prison farm. And then he's just making some of it up, but it is still just fiction. And they build, but one of the reasons it looks so good is that they build an exact replica of the prison farm he's on. I think it's Road Prison 36, which was also at one time referred to as Sunbeam Prison Camp, which is just great that you'd call a place that's such a hellhole Sunbeam Prison Camp. In Duval County, Florida, I have no idea where that is. But he bases, I think, a core part, I don't know if you guys read this, but the core part of the character of Luke is based on a prisoner called Arthur Malafert. There's a story that Pierce, here when he's in Road Prison 36, is this incredibly charismatic 19-year-old guy who was in prison actually back in the early 1930s. And his story had just continued on. And he was like really charismatic, and he was apparently like an amazing escaper and a complete rebel. He would escape all the time. He would rebel against the bosses. And what happens is that one night the guards put Malafert in one of the sweat boxes, those windowless outdoor solitary confinement cells, and he dies. And there's some evidence also, and it's some evidence that he's strangled by the chain that held him in place in the sweat box. But anyway, this is a real case. You can read about it online. And it actually received a whole lot of a whole lot of media reporting. There's an article in the New York Times. There's a 1932 piece from Time magazine that you can read online. It actually apparently got some international press. And there was a trial that involved some of the guards who were accused of being responsible for Malafert's death. And of course, no one ever saw the inside of it. None of the guards ever saw the inside of a prison. The guards, I think one guard was convicted of manslaughter, but he paid a bond and he never spent a night in prison. But Pierce heard the story of Malafert in prison, and combined, that's a core part of the narrative in novel Cool Hand Luke.
Yeah, I just knew that he was a real con. I don't know.
He was a con.
I don't know when he wrote this compared to when, because it doesn't sound like they were allowed anything in the joint. So he's not writing it while he's in prison.
He wrote it partly in prison.
Wow. It must have been longhand.
My understanding is that he started jotting down things while he was in prison. Then he got out of prison. He wrote the book. You've read the book, Mike. I've read the book. I don't know, El Goro, whether you managed to look at the book, but it's written in that weird style where there's no inverted commas for the dialogue. So there's quite a sort of
that kind of Cormac McCarthy style.
Yeah. And apparently then he works on the book for a number of years until he finally gets rejected by publisher after publisher until it eventually gets picked up.
I hadn't finished the book. I was reading bits of it in preparation for this, but I wasn't able to fit it in the whole thing, unfortunately. But it is one that I do intend on reading, along with, because we're talking about Don Pierce, and immediately when I start thinking about prisoner who writes books that then get adapted into films, my mind immediately goes to Eddie Bunker, who, of course, did No Beast So Fierce, which was turned into Straight Time, and Animal Factory. If we want to talk about a rather brutal depiction of prison life, Animal Factory is right up there.
I found a copy of Cool Hand Luke, the original gold medal film adaptation, the film tie, in a secondhand bookshop in Kampot, Cambodia in the mid-90s. I don't know what it was doing there. Kampot is this town on the tiny town in the south of Cambodia, which at that stage was surrounded by sort of Khmer Rouge guerrillas.
So one of the CIA agents must have left it behind when they were not there.
I think you're actually closer than you know with that. But carrying it around with me for ages, when I was doing this podcast, I plucked it off the shelf and went, I'm going to read. So I started reading. I took it with me to a screening of June 3rd and then lost it in the cinema and I couldn't finish it. And then I rang up the cinema and said, I got really specific, has someone found my 1967 gold medal paperback edition of Cool Hand Luke in the cinema? And the woman said, no. And I went, you're lying. I didn't say that, but I thought that. Oh, yes, you have it. It's cool and someone's taken it. So that's a total diversion. I only read about half.
See, now I like the idea of it continuing to travel and the legend of this book.
Yes. I wish I don't know if I put my name. Prison writing, and this is something that's really interesting because I think, and this is something we can talk about when we talk about prison films, because prison films, prisoners writing, prisoners being parts of a creative community and publishing books was something that I think was coincided with that huge upsurge in prisoners' rights campaigning when conditions in prison was actually a mainstream issue in the second half of the 1960s and the 1970s and even into the 1980s. And as you say, there's heaps of writers for whom Bunker is one. There's another guy who wrote a book called If He Hollers, Let Him Go, and he also wrote On the Yard. There's a guy who wrote a book called On the Yard whose name I can't quite.
It looks like the gentleman was Malcolm Braley.
Malcolm Braley. You are faster on Google than me. Braley. He Rattles, Let Him Go, I think it is one amongst the beatnik scene in San Francisco in the mid-1960s. But On the Yard by Braley is another one. Lots of Australians. I mean, there was this whole thing for a while that Australians would get banged up in Thai prisons, and this joke going around that if you really wanted to become a good a really good writer, you'd basically go to the best finishing school for writers in Australia, which was a Thai prison.
If you're an author in Australia, aren't you automatically a prison author since your whole...
Oh, I like that, Mike. Very nice. Very nice. Yes. Yeah.
That was a low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah, sorry.
No, I'll take it with pride. Absolutely.
Well, let's go ahead and take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about some other prison movies. And we'll be back right after these brief messages.
You obviously love podcasts, but are you also a fan of movies and television? Do you want to listen to a show that reviews entertainment honestly and casts pretentiousness to the wind? That debates both film and TV topics in a fun, good-spirited way, while still getting to the heart of why we all love them so much? Then don't miss the award-winning weekly podcast, The Hollywood Outsider, now available on your favorite podcast app or at thehollywoodoutsider.com.
All right, we're back and talking about Cool Hand Luke. We are not talking about Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park in the break. Believe me. I wanted to talk about prison movies. We've been dancing around prison movies here. I don't tend to like too many prison movies because they fall into so many tropes that we see over and over again. Even though the most tropiest, I imagine, is Shawshank, and I really like Shawshank. And I don't know. Oh my
God, Mike!
Am I a criminal here? Okay, thank you.
I'm right there with you.
It's fucking Brown. Come on.
And part of it, you can't really. I think I'm obliged because I live like an hour away from where Shawshank was shot. So all of us make a pilgrimage to Mansfield at one time in our lives. But no, I absolutely adore Shawshank, and I know it's fashionable to put, in certain segments, to push back against the sentimentality of it, as to something like Green Mile.
Oh, yeah.
If we're going to talk about prison films featuring an allegorical Christ figure, little Lord.
John Coffey, J.C. Yeah.
Stephen King is not a subtle writer.
No.
He's a painting writer, but not a subtle writer. So yes, those ones are the ones where I would imagine, particularly for people around my age, that would have been one of the earlier sort of exposures, unless they were digging into older films, to the concept of prison drama. That, and if they happened to have a subscription to HBO, they would have perhaps caught an episode of Oz, which talk about brutality in prison.
The Shawshank Redemption is to prison films what Schindler's List is to Nazi exploitation.
Wow.
The artistic version?
It's just the terrible mainstream.
Okay.
I'm happy to say that prison films, I think, is one of the one areas of cinema where I don't think America has produced the best prison film.
Okay, so what would be your counter?
I really like, and I'm going to mangle his name, Jacques Audiard's A Prophet in 2009, which is a French prison film. I really like The Whole or The Truth. That's a Jacques Becker 1960 prison film. I like Bronson.
Oh, I love Bronson.
Yeah,
adore Bronson.
I just think this is one area. I think the best prison films I've seen are from Australia. And you look at films like Stephen Wallace's Stir, a 1980 film, which I recently did a commentary for Severin Films, so I'm completely full bottle on that. Ghosts of the Civil Dead by John Hillcoat in 1988. There's a terrific Australian prison film from 1994 called Every Night. And I also think Points to Chopper in 2000. I mean, 4 really solid Australian prison film, and that's not even counting arguably the large number of prison films that much more broader concept of a prison film which involve Indigenous Black Australians. So, I mean, probably my favourite of those films, the one I did the commentary for, is Stir by Stephen Wallace in 1980. It's a terrific film, but I think there are some good American prison films. I think I like Brute Force by Dassan. I like Don Siegel's Riot and Cell Block 11. I'm trying to think of other ones. I mean, there's other ones. I like From the Yard. I think it's quite good. But I think this is one area I think where, I don't think that America has produced the best prison film. So that's my second hot take for the podcast.
Perhaps you've never seen Johnny Dangerously. It has some of the better.
Is that the one with Mickey Rourke?
No, that's Johnny Handsome. Johnny Dangerous is Michael Keaton and Joe Piscopo.
So you've already blown that one off. Yeah, come on. Come again. Hit me again. Are we talking about jokes or are we talking about serious?
I'll tell you what, one that I absolutely adore from recent years. This one is more. Yeah, I have not seen Paddington 2, but I've heard it's an excellent film.
Prisons.
It does, yeah.
Paddington Goes to Prison. All right. But it's certainly more on what you would refer to as prison exploitation type things. It's the line to be drawn between an attempt at a serious drama and ones that are just using the prison setting in furtherance of essentially an exploitation plot. But it was S. Craig Zoller's Brawl in Cell Block 99.
Oh my God, that is good. Yeah, I agree. I like that film. I like his stuff generally.
Yeah. As a novelist, as a filmmaker, he's top notch for me.
It's interesting that you talked about Oz. I had a lengthy Twitter exchange. Yes, I am still on X. Certainly. Lengthy X exchange recently with a whole lot of people. I found the entire series of Oz in an op shop recently. And I was tweeting out, I X'd out, I posted out, look, how many of these should I pick up? Is this any good? And I ended up buying the first 2, but a series that people came back and said, this is virtually to a person, said this is brilliant, especially the first 2 series. And it's interesting the way that Oz, because there's also been talk about the golden age of television is over. And Oz was one of those shows, along with The Sopranos and a couple of other shows that really were presaged that whole golden age of television. No one ever talks about Oz, though. It's forgotten.
It gets overshadowed, especially by The Sopranos. A lot of people will talk about, and that was one where when HBO first started a streaming service, where it's just like HBO On Demand or something like that, that was actually the first of their series I sat and watched from beginning to end. I had these notions that I would watch the prestige HBO shows. So okay, let's do all of Oz. And then I went on from Oz onto The Sopranos and go through it. And yes, there is variable quality from season to season, sometimes episode to episode. But when that show was on, and it's more than just the sum of its brutality, there were some wonderful character moments to be found within the context of that show. And it was definitely going into some very heavy material at a time where even today you couldn't imagine certain people engaging with the same material the same way that Oz did it.
I've never seen any of it, so I'm very keen. It passed me by, and again, I bought a bootleg of the entire, whatever it is, 6 seasons of Oz from a market in Cambodia in 2008. That's the only place I buy physical media is in Cambodia. And I bought it back, and I know it's going to be one of those compressed DVDs, but rammed the whole series onto about 3 discs, and it's going to look terrible. So
100 episodes a disc.
Literally, that's what it's like. And that's how I watch the X-Files. So I'm very keen to watch these nice, pristine DVD versions of Oz. That's going to be one of my viewing projects.
You mentioned Don Siegel. I think one of my favorite prison movies is probably Escape from Alcatraz. I really like The Longest Yard, and that's both the original and the remake. I surprisingly liked the remake.
Are we counting the remake with Adam Sandler or the remake in England with Vinnie Jones?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the Adam Sandler version.
Because Mean Machine is a lot of fun.
Some of the character actors, William Fichtner being in there. Yeah, but then you also have all the character actors that are in the first one, too. It just works very well. Yeah, those are the ones. I don't tend to do a lot of prison movies. I did watching some of the extras on the Blu-ray for Cool Hand Luke. It's pretty much just one extra, and I think it might have been made for TCM. There's a lot of really good interviews in it, but it moves very quickly. It's only half an hour long. By the time we were talking for a half an hour, I don't even know if Luke was in prison yet. Trying to cover that whole movie in half an hour, but they were saying, oh yeah, it's a Warner Brothers movie. They're famous for two things. One is prison movies, and the other is letting their main characters die. And they're not mutually exclusive. I was like, okay, yeah, I can see that, because there were so many prison movies back in the 30s and 40s from Warner Brothers. That was a real staple of their films.
And if continuing on the notion of the prison exploitation ones, again, not high art, but high entertainment. You can't go wrong with Riccio in terms of prison films. And I also worship at the altar of direct-to-video, or I suppose in this point, direct-to-streaming action films. And that gets into the territory very heavily of Scott Adkins. He, of course, doing the immediate sequels to Walter Hill's Undisputed films. Which, they're martial arts tournament movies set in a prison. That's all they are. And they're very entertaining for what they are.
Another of the films that I watched on a Sunday night with my parents back in the early to mid-'80s that left a real indelible mark on me is Papillon.
Yes, Papillon is fantastic.
Which is an American-French co-production, so there you go. Just for those people who are about to switch off protection boot, because I said that comment about the Americans not making good prison films. That is a great. I've been wanting to clear some time, because I think it's a beast of a film. It goes for about 3.5 hours, doesn't it?
Something about that.
Yeah, but I just remember, I haven't watched it for a long time, but I was completely transfixed by Papillon, and I just remember it not being afraid to go anywhere.
And we had alluded to earlier a few times in the episode, the film Brubaker, which from the same director.
Is good, yes.
And that one, I wasn't
looking back from my comments now.
When I start with Shawshank, you're immediately going to go on the attack.
Oh, absolutely.
And that was a film that I'd watched recently, and I actually hadn't intended it necessarily in preparation for this. It was just a nice little bit of cinematic kismet. That sometimes what I like to do is just chase whimsy when it comes times for setting out what I'm going to watch. And I got it into my head after I read a book recently. I'm going to watch every Nicolas Cage film I've not seen. And top of the list was apparently, and he had an uncredited role in this film called Brubaker. So I just fired it up, check it out. Oh, there's Robert Redford. Let's have fun with this. Only to realize, same director as Cool Hand Luke, dealing with very similar territory, but again, with the lessening of the standards, or the increasing of what they could actually show in the film, definitely was a much more brutal prison film compared to Cool Hand Luke.
I remember liking it. I'm just still dealing with you creating your own form of prison by wanting to watch every Nicolas Cage.
At this point, just shy of 40, I can say without reservation that I am a fan of Nicolas Cage and his nouveau shamanic.
I remember Brubaker being very good. I think I watched a very grainy, dark copy of it. I could hardly see it. I could just see Redford's blonde hair every now and again. It's pretty dark, gritty, grim film, isn't it?
Very much, and it was very nice to see Yaphet Kotto in that a year after Alien.
Yeah, I'm looking at the cast list right now, and it's another just stacked casting, like Murray Hamilton, David Keith, Morgan Freeman, Matt Clark, Tim McIntyre, M. Emmett Walsh, who we mentioned before, Everett McGill, Val Avery, who also was in The Laughing Policeman, and then even Joe Spinell. And you can't go wrong with Joe Spinell. I think that was...
Oh God, what's he playing? Is he playing one of the drag queen or something?
No, he's actually playing one, and it's a film that's much, much more about the kind of dynamics of particularly the trustees, the prisoners who have been elevated to the position of guards. And he's one of the trustees. Everett McGill is one of the trustees. And there's some dark stuff with Everett McGill in that film.
So I mentioned the DVD or Blu-ray, I should say, of this, and they do have that one extra on there. They've got a audio commentary that's very good on there. One thing that I was hoping that they would have or be available somewhere is a Bruce Conner movie. Apparently, Bruce Conner was invited out to the set by his buddy Dennis Hopper, and he shot a bunch of footage, and that became a art piece called Luke. And it's just basically behind the scenes footage of them filming. And I know for sure, looking at a still from it, you get to see more of the road tarring scene. I would just love to see it as a little piece of ephemera, just to see what it was like to be on this set. I am surprised there's not more things written about Cool Hand Luke. That was very shocking to me. Of course, there's a lot of articles about the Christ stuff. There was actually somebody's basically high school or maybe college paper comparing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with a Cool Hand Luke, which was hilarious to find on, I think, Academia or something. But yeah, I'm surprised there aren't books written about this movie and book.
It's the Rosenberg effect. He's a marginalized director. If Arthur Penn had done Cool Hand Luke, you would not be able to move to the amount of commentary and special Blu-ray releases and articles that this film would have generated, or a director of that caliber. Yeah, none of those Rosenberg films, I don't think, even have blues. I think most of them don't even have blues. Well, a lot of them wouldn't have blues. Laughing Policeman, I know that...
Amityville definitely does.
Move isn't even available on any format.
Yeah, it's the Rosenberg effect. But we love you, Stuart. You were really good.
On that note, let's go ahead and take another break and play a preview for next week's show right after these brief messages.
Joseph K. Joseph K.
You're under arrest.
Who accuses me? What's the charge?
Mr. K, you seriously think that we don't know who you are?
Who are these people?
The accused.
How do you know you're arrested?
They woke me up and told me.
Are you sure you were awake?
This could be a trap.
Can there be any doubt that behind my arrest, a vast organization is at work?
There isn't a hope of getting out of their clutches.
You can't all be guilty.
You'll have to kill me!
To be in chains is sometimes safer than to be free.
That's right. Last week was the execution. This week was the punishment. And next week, we are talking about Orson Welles' The Trial. Until then, I want to thank this week's co-host, El Goro and Andrew. Andrew, what's the buzz? Tell me what's happening.
What's happening? I'm trying to write a novel. And as you won't know, but we're about to enter the editing phase for the book that you have a chapter in, Revolution in 35mm, Political Violence and Resistance in Films from the Art House through the Grindhouse, 1960 to 1990. It will be out through PM Press later on this year.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, I know. It's a long time.
A nickname, a shorter name?
Revolution in 35mm.
Perfect. And El Goro, how about yourself?
Still continuing on with my film podcast, the Talk Without Rhythm podcast, a weekly film discussion podcast where generally I'll take two films that are somewhat tangentially tied together by a theme and talk about them. Recently been doing a lot of Patreon picks, which is always nice. I get exposed to a lot of films that I hadn't thought to cover. And sometimes I'm joined by my very generous patrons. Not to date this episode, but you already did mention that we were recording this on Easter weekend, so it's not too bad. The most recent one that I'll be recording tomorrow will be a discussion of the lovely Lion classic Roar and the Werner Herzog documentary Grizzly Man. When people decide to step over that boundary with interacting with animals.
You don't want to watch that video?
I would destroy it. It would be the white elephant in the room. I adore Grizzly Man, and Roar is a lot of fun as well, so that should be a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, guys, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. If you want to hear more of me shooting off my mouth, check out some of the other shows that I work on. They are all available at weirdingwaymedia.com. Thanks especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join the community, visit patreon.com/projectionbooth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.
Well, I don't care if it rains or freezes, as long as I've got my plastic Jesus riding on the dashboard of my car. Well, through my trials and tribulations and my travels across the nation, me and my plastic Jesus will go far. Plastic Jesus, he's a riding on the dashboard of my car. Well, through my trials and tribulations and my travels across the nation, me and my plastic Jesus will go far.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Hell, it saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, yeah, but now I can see. Yeah. Well, do Lord, oh, do you remember me? I said, do Lord, oh, God damn it, you remember me. Lord, oh, do you remember me? Way beyond the blue.
The line now, get the pole, honey. You get the line now, get the pole, now, buddy. You get the line now, get the pole, we'll all get drunk in the crawly. Oh, honey, sweet lady of mine. Yeah. What you gonna do when the creek runs dry, honey? What you gonna do when your beer runs dry, honey? What you gonna do when the Lord runs dry? You're gonna suck on his blood and cry, cry, oh, honey, sweet lady of mine. Well, beat-a-blee-double, are you in beer run? Beat-a-blee-double, are you in beer run? Well, me and my friends gonna get messed up when we get back to the big beer room. Beat-a-blee-double, are you in beer run? Rock and go! Beat-a-blee-double, are you in beer run? Beat-a-blee-double, are you in beer run? Well, me and the Lord are gonna get messed up when we get back to the big beer room. Beat-a-blee-double, are you in beer run? Rock it! Well, I don't care if it rains or freezes, as long as I've got my plastic Jesus riding on the dashboard of my car. Man, I can still just have to go